A day that changed everything. Imagine the most important Friday of all time, almost 2,000 years ago. It was on this day that something incredible happened. Jesus, the Son of God, died on a cross. This moment was so remarkable that it is recorded in the 4 Gospels of the Bible, each one providing incredible details about what happened. They tell us not only what happened, but also why it was so special. But before that, check if you have already written, like and share the video. Let's go. Much more than pain. Did you know that Jesus' death was not just about physical suffering? It is true that being crucified was one of the most painful ways to die at that time, but what happened there was much more profound. The Bible explains that Jesus was carrying the weight of the mistakes of all humanity. He felt a separation from God that was much worse than any pain in the body. It was as if he was paying a huge price to bring us closer to God again. Why does this matter? This moment was not just a sad story. It was a gigantic act of love. Jesus chose to go through all of this because he wanted to open a way for all of us to have a relationship with God. So when we look at the cross, it is not only a symbol of suffering, but also of hope, forgiveness, and a love that never ends. Jesus and his life story. Let's think a little about the life of Jesus. He was about 33 years old when he died. During the last 3 years, he lived in a way that no one had ever seen before. He left his home, traveled through cities and towns, spoke to thousands of people, and did incredible things. He gave sight to the blind, healed people who could not walk, multiplied food for multitudes, and even calmed storms with just a few words. During this time, he showed that he was much more than just a man. He was the Son of God, full of love and compassion for everyone, understanding the calculations of time. But what about this story of the calendar? The thing is, when they created our modern calendar, the one we use today, called the Gregorian calendar, they tried to make the year 1 mark the birth of Jesus. But the scholars who put this together got their calculations a little wrong. It was later discovered that Jesus was probably born between 6 and 4 BC. Yes, before the BC itself should begin. This changes the timeline a bit, and today, based on many studies and evidence, historians believe that Jesus was crucified between 27 and 29 AD. What was happening at that time? Now, to better understand, let's think about the world in which Jesus lived. He was born and raised in the region of Palestine, which at that time was part of the Roman Empire. The Romans were very powerful and controlled almost the entire known world. The people lived under Roman law, paid a lot of taxes, and were anxiously awaiting a liberator, someone who could bring peace and justice. It was into this scenario that Jesus appeared, but he did not come as people imagined. Instead of being a warrior king, he came with a message of love, forgiveness, and a spiritual kingdom. Jesus' mission. From the beginning, Jesus knew that his mission was more than just teaching or performing miracles. He came to do something great, to offer his life for all. This is something he understood long before he was 33. He dedicated his life to showing us the way to God, and his death and resurrection changed history forever. Why is this fascinating? These historical details not only make the story of Jesus more real, but they also show us how everything was perfectly aligned. He lived in a strategic time and place where his message could spread quickly throughout the world. This explains why, even 2,000 years later, we are here talking about him. Jesus is not just a historical figure. He is the center of a story that transformed the past and continues to change lives in the present. The painful path to the cross. The betrayal in the garden. It all began on a Thursday night in a place called Gethsemane. Imagine a quiet garden full of olive trees where Jesus was praying deeply. He knew that something very difficult was about to happen. Meanwhile, Judas, one of his 12 disciples, one who walked with him, ate with him, and saw all his miracles, came to the garden, but he didn't come to help. He brought soldiers and religious leaders, pointed out who Jesus was with a kiss, betraying the master himself for a few pieces of silver. How sad that must have been! An unfair trial. After this, Jesus was taken to a court called the Sanhedrin, made up of religious leaders of the time. They were determined to convict him, but they had a problem. There were no real charges. So they brought in witnesses who lied, accusing Jesus of blasphemy, saying that he was God, something they considered unforgivable. But the Sanhedrin had no power to condemn anyone to death, so they had to take the case to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate and Herod, a tug-of-war of power. When Jesus was taken to Pilate, the governor was uncomfortable. He saw no real reason to convict him, so he tried to pass the buck to Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee, where Jesus came from. But Herod, after mocking and ridiculing Jesus, sent him back to Pilate, as if to say, "This is not my problem." Now Pilate was cornered. Even though he found no fault in Jesus, he gave in to the pressure of the crowd, who shouted, "Crucify him!" Physical suffering. Even before the crucifixion, Jesus went through terrible tortures. He was whipped with a whip that was not common. It was made of leather strips with pieces of metal and bones attached to the ends. Each blow tore off pieces of his skin and even injured his muscles and internal organs. In addition, he was humiliated in cruel ways. The Roman soldiers laughed at him, saying that he was a king, and to mock him even more, they put on him a purple cloak, the color of kings, and a crown made of thorns that pierced his head. They beat him and spat on him, laughing at his pain. Why does all this matter? Even in the midst of so much physical and emotional suffering, Jesus remained firm. He did not fight, he did not respond with anger, because he knew that it was all part of a greater plan. He chose to go through all this out of love, a love so great that it is hard to imagine. When we think about what he endured, we can better understand how much he cares about us and how his courage changed the world forever. The difficult walk to Calvary. Carrying the weight of the world. After everything Jesus had already suffered, the scourging, the humiliation, the extreme fatigue, he was forced to carry something even heavier, the cross on which he would be crucified. Just imagine. This cross was gigantic and could weigh up to 80 kilos, almost like carrying a large adult on his back. Sometimes, the condemned carried only the top part, called the horizontal beam, but some say that Jesus had to carry the entire cross. No matter which version you imagine, the weight was unbearable, especially after everything he had already been through. The path full of difficulties. The walk to Calvary, the place where Jesus would be crucified, was neither short nor easy. He was exhausted, bruised and bleeding profusely because of the brutal scourging he had suffered earlier. Every step was a struggle. Even though Jesus was strong and determined, his body could not bear the weight of the cross all the way. He fell, and it was clear that he could not continue alone. The unexpected help. It was then that a man named Simon, who was coming from the city of Cyrene, was called by the soldiers to help. Imagine just passing by, perhaps returning from work or visiting Jerusalem, and suddenly being pulled to carry the cross of a man condemned to death. Simon had not planned on this, but he was forced to help. He took the weight that Jesus could no longer carry alone and walked alongside him all the way to Calvary. The meaning of this walk. This scene is much more than just a part of the story. It shows us the humanity of Jesus. He was the Son of God, but he also had a human body, which felt pain and fatigue like any of us. It also makes us think about Simon. He may not have understood what was happening at that moment, but he had the honor of helping Jesus in one of the most difficult moments of his life. It's a reminder that sometimes we can be called to do something important, even when we don't expect it. Why does all this matter? The walk to Calvary wasn't just about carrying a heavy cross. It was about carrying the weight of the sins of the entire world. Every step Jesus took was a demonstration of love and sacrifice. And even when he couldn't go it alone, someone was there to help him. A powerful message that sometimes we need help and that helping others is part of God's plan, too. The crucifixion, the hardest moment, nailed to the cross. Have you ever been hurt by something small, like a thorn or a splinter? Now imagine huge nails, about 5 inches long, piercing your hands and feet. That's what they did to Jesus when they nailed him to the cross. These nails weren't driven in carefully. They were hammered in cruelly, causing excruciating bleeding and pain that is almost beyond description. The cross, which was already heavy and difficult to carry, now became the place where Jesus would hang, suffering humiliation in front of everyone. As if the physical pain were not enough, Jesus was also ridiculed. Above his head, they placed a sign that said, "King of the Jews." But this was not a title of respect, it was a way of mocking him. Crucifixion was the most humiliating and painful type of execution of all time, used by the Romans to punish the worst criminals and slaves. They wanted to show that Jesus, even though he was called king, was treated as someone of no value. The suffering on the cross. Being on the cross did not only mean being held down by nails. Jesus' entire body suffered in horrific ways. He suffered intense cramps because of the forced position. Extreme thirst made him even weaker, and he lost a lot of blood because of his wounds. His breathing was also a challenge. In order to breathe, Jesus had to stand up using his feet, which were nailed shut, which caused unbearable pain. Death on the cross usually came by asphyxiation, hemorrhage, or even a heart attack, after hours, or even days, of suffering. The small offer of relief. In the midst of all this, someone offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a substance that could help ease the pain a little. But he refused, because he wanted to endure everything fully, without anything that would diminish what he was going through. Later, they offered him vinegar in a sponge to quench his thirst, but that didn't change the reality of what he was going through. What all this teaches us: Jesus' crucifixion was one of the most painful and humiliating moments anyone could imagine, but he endured it all for a very special reason: love. He didn't have to go through it, he chose to. He chose to carry the weight of all humanity's mistakes to give us the chance to be forgiven and live close to God. When we look at the cross, it reminds us of a gigantic sacrifice and a love that is greater than any pain or suffering. It's a difficult story, but also full of hope. Incredible phenomena during the death of Jesus. The world stopped to feel. Have you ever seen something so impactful that it seemed that even nature reacted? That was exactly what happened at the moment Jesus died on the cross. Something so extraordinary and grandiose happened that the sky, the earth, and even the Temple of Jerusalem gave powerful signs. Mysterious darkness. Imagine that, out of nowhere, the sky went completely dark, even though it was the middle of the day. That's what happened. For 3 whole hours, the light of the sun disappeared. It wasn't a storm or a common eclipse. It was something supernatural, as if creation was mourning what was happening to Jesus. The people who were there were frightened and probably wondered what it meant. An impressive earthquake. As if the darkness weren't enough, a huge earthquake shook the city of Jerusalem and its surroundings. Houses shook, the ground shook, and people must have run in despair. This earthquake was not just a natural phenomenon. It was as if the earth was feeling the greatness of the moment, marking Jesus' sacrifice. The temple veil is torn. In the Temple of Jerusalem, there was a huge curtain called the veil. It was very special because it separated the most sacred place, where only the high priest could enter, from the rest of the temple. When Jesus died, this veil was torn from top to bottom, as if an invisible hand had cut it. This was a clear sign that something had changed forever. The barrier between God and people had been torn down. Now, everyone could approach God without needing intermediaries. Why was this so special? These events were not coincidences. Every detail, the darkness, the earthquake, and the torn veil, was like a message from God, showing that Jesus' death was not the end, but the beginning of something incredible. It was the sign that a new path to God was open to everyone, and that Jesus' sacrifice had a grand purpose. It was as if heaven and earth were saying, "Pay attention, something very important is happening." The death of Jesus, the most important moment. 6 hours of suffering and love. Jesus hung on the cross for about 6 hours. He was placed there around 9 a.m. and did not die until around 3 p.m. During all this time, he suffered indescribable pain, feeling the weight of everything he was carrying. Not only physical suffering, but also spiritual suffering. But even in the midst of all this, he remained steadfast. When the time came, Jesus did not simply die. He made an important decision. He gave up his spirit to the Father, saying, "It is finished." This means that he had finished his mission, done everything he needed to do to save us. The final sign of confirmation. To make sure that Jesus was truly dead, a Roman soldier used a spear to pierce his side. When he did so, something incredible happened. Blood and water came out. Doctors explain that this may have happened because Jesus' heart had already stopped beating and fluid had accumulated in his chest, which is a sign that he died with his heart literally broken, both from physical suffering and from the weight of bearing the sins of all humanity. Why is this so special? Jesus' death was unlike any other in history. He was not defeated. He chose to die, giving his life as a perfect sacrifice. Even at the end, he was in control, trusting completely in the Father. This moment marked the point at which God's plan for salvation was complete. It's hard to think about all the suffering, but it's also beautiful to remember that he did it all out of love for each one of us. The burial of Jesus, a special moment before the great miracle. A different tomb. Did you know that, at that time, people who were crucified usually did not receive a dignified burial? Often, the bodies were left exposed for everyone to see or thrown into mass graves. But with Jesus it was different. A rich man named Joseph of Arimathea, who believed in Jesus and respected him greatly, asked permission to take care of his body. Joseph prepared everything carefully and placed Jesus in a new tomb, made in a rock, that no one had used before. This showed that, even after so much suffering, Jesus was treated with dignity. A great promise was about to be fulfilled. This burial seemed like the end of the story for those who were there. But, in fact, it was just the beginning of something wonderful. Jesus had said several times that he would die, but that, on the third day, he would come back to life. Many may not have believed or understood how this would be possible, but God was about to show something incredible to the whole world. The third day, the miracle of the resurrection. Early on Sunday morning, when some women went to the tomb to take care of Jesus' body, they had the biggest surprise of their lives. The tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, conquering death and fulfilling his divine mission. He did not stay in the tomb because death could not hold him. This was the moment that changed everything, showing that Jesus is the Savior and that, through him, we can all have a new life. Why is this so important? Jesus' burial was like a moment of silence before the greatest miracle of all time. It reminds us that, even when everything seems lost, God has a plan. And the resurrection gives us the certainty that life is much greater than death. It is the victory that God planned for all of us. The meaning of Jesus' death, more than we can imagine. The pain that went beyond the physical. When we think of Jesus' death, we often think of the physical suffering. The nails, the scourging, the crown of thorns, and the cross. But what happened was much deeper than that. Jesus felt a spiritual pain so great that no human being could ever bear it. He carried upon himself the weight of all the sins of the world, of all people, of all times. And in that moment, he experienced something he had never felt before: separation from God the Father. It was so painful that he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This abandonment was the price Jesus was paying to give us the chance to be close to God, facing the impossible. On top of all that, Jesus faced something we might call the terror of hell. He felt the punishment and judgment that we deserved because of our mistakes. He took it all upon himself, even though he was perfect and sinless. It was a suffering so intense that only Jesus, as the Son of God, could bear it. Judgment and grace, the perfect balance. Jesus' death was not just about pain, it was also about God's incredible plan. On the one hand, it showed God's judgment against sin. God does not ignore what is wrong. He is just and holy. But at the same time, the cross was the greatest demonstration of love and grace. Jesus died in our place, showing that God did not want anyone to be condemned. He offered everyone the chance to be forgiven and have a new life. Why is this so important? Jesus' death is like a bridge. On one side, we see God's justice. which does not tolerate sin. On the other, we see his love, which did the impossible to rescue us. Jesus stood in the middle, connecting these two sides and opening the way for all of us to reach God. He faced pain, abandonment, and punishment out of love, a love so great that it gives us the opportunity to live in peace with God and with hope in our hearts. That's what makes the cross so special. Conclusion: God's perfect plan. Much more than a historical event, Jesus' death was not something that simply happened by chance or some random tragedy. It was the fulfillment of a plan that God had since the beginning of everything, before the world even existed. Just imagine, before creating the heavens, the earth, the stars and people, God already knew that he would need to send Jesus to save us. Isn't that incredible? Jesus was not surprised by what happened. He always knew that he would give his life for us. The perfect Lamb. In the Bible, Jesus is called the Lamb of God. This is because, in the past, people offered lambs as sacrifices to get closer to God. But none of these sacrifices were enough to completely erase sins. Therefore, Jesus came as the perfect Lamb, without sin, without flaws. He gave his life as an eternal sacrifice, valid forever, so that all of us could be forgiven. A love that embraces the world. When Jesus died, he did so for all people, of all times and places. He didn't choose to die just for the good or the strong. He died for everyone, even those who haven't even been born yet. He loved us so much that he was willing to face anything to make way for God. Why does this change everything? Jesus' death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something wonderful. He showed us that God's love is greater than any mistake we can make. He gave us a chance to be free from sin and live a life full of hope and purpose. When we understand this, we realize that the cross is not just a symbol of suffering, but a victory and a love that never ends. That's why Jesus' death remains so important, even after all this time. It reminds us that each and every one of us is precious to God. Share this message so that more people can learn the true meaning of Jesus' death.